In this video, we will go through the overview of steps to integrate SAP with LDAP. So for those of us who have worked with GRC, with SAP GRC, we would have seen that the SAP in many cases, SAP GRC uses Active Directory or LDAP as a data source for user provisioning, okay, for searching the user related data, anything related to user, right? So LDAP is configured as a data source. Now, what does LDAP stand for? LDAP stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, okay? Now, it's a protocol that makes it possible for various applications in the IT landscape to access common information at a central location. Okay, so you can use LDAP to query any user information rapidly. Okay, so it is basically it's like an IT address book. Okay, address book for information that is usually common to applications. Okay, so for you take any applications, right? So there are certain pieces of information that are common, right? Like for example, the personal data, which is made up of, let's say, the first name, last name, the department in which the user is working, the organization the user works for, right? And user data, right, such as the user account, the authorizations that the user has on your different systems in your network, for example, the public key certificates that are assigned to that user. Okay, and also information about system resources and system services. Okay, like the printer configuration is one such example. So for example, if someone within your office wants to do two things, right? One is send an email to a recent hire and also print a copy of that conversation onto a printer. Okay, so this LDAP protocol, right, makes that possible. Okay, both these two tasks of sending an email and printing makes it possible because that information is stored, the required information is stored in a central location on the LDAP solution. Okay, so you set it properly, you set up LDAP properly, and that employee does not need to talk with IT to complete those tasks. Okay, so with LDAP, companies store usernames, passwords, email addresses, printer connections, and other static data within directories. Okay, so it is a vendor neutral application protocol for accessing and maintaining all such data. And if you have also worked with a single sign-on environment setup, you will realize that LDAP can also tackle authentication. Okay, so with single sign-on, users can sign on just once and access many different files on the server. So in many places with SAP, when SAP is implemented in single sign-on, single sign-on is implemented in SAP environments, the SAP user ID is the same as your network user ID, which is your LDAP user ID. Okay. LDAP is a protocol, so it does not specify how directory programs work. Okay, so instead, it's a form of language that allows users to find the information they need very, very quickly. Okay, and we will talk about how we can find the information that we need as we go along with this presentation. Okay. Now, like I said earlier, LDAP is a vendor neutral solution. So it can be used with variety of different directory programs. Okay. So, so typically a directory contains data that is one descriptive, um, such as the name and location, which come together make up something called as an asset. Data that is static, which means the data in Active Directory doesn't change much, but when it does, these changes are very subtle. And the data is also valuable, meaning that the data stored within the directory is critical to the core business functions. Okay. Now, sometimes people use LDAP in concert with other systems throughout their workday. Okay, so for example, employees may use LDAP to connect with printers or verify passwords. Okay, so those employees may then switch to Google or for email, which doesn't really rely on LDAP at all. Now, some people use LDAP and Active Directory interchangeably. Okay, so when we talk LDAP, we think it's an Active Directory, but when we say Active Directory, we at the same time we also say it's LDAP. Okay, it's basically an habit, right? And this habit causes a great deal of confusion. So these two tools, right, Active Directory, and LDAP, they work together, but they're definitely not the same thing. Okay. Now, Active Directory is a proprietary directory tool that is used to organize IT assets such as computers, printers, and users. Okay, it's a Microsoft product. Active Directory is a Microsoft product. Okay, which is commonly used within the Windows environment. And if you have worked with Windows on a network, this system underpins some of the data, right? And LDAP, on the other hand, is a protocol that can read Active Directory, okay, data from the Active Directory. But you can also use it with other programs, okay, including those based on Linux. So LDAP and Active Directory work together to help users, okay, but they don't compete with one another, and they do not do exactly the same thing. Okay, so LDAP is a protocol and Active Directory is one of the LDAP types. Okay, comes in. So Active Directory is, let's say, comes under LDAP. Okay. Now, when you work with LDAP, there are few terminologies that you need to be familiar with. One is called the distinguished name, which is a unique identifier for each record that also describes the location within the information tree. So there are different nodes, there is a hierarchy, there is an information tree that is that you have in LDAP or Active Directory, and the path of the identifier of that record identifier is called the distinguished name. Okay. Another terminology is the relative distinguished name, which is a way of tying distinguished names together. Okay. Another important terminology that you will hear a lot is called the schema. Okay. So this is the schema contains the attributes, okay, of let's say the fields that make up a record within Active Directory. Okay, so your last name, first name, the manager, email ID, the company, anything related to a personnel, okay, information is an attribute, and all these attributes together make up a schema. So you also need to know what a URL is. Basically, URL is a address and contains address and a port of a server. And then you also need to know what a uniform resource identifier is, URI. It's a string of characters that define a source. So what do you need to consider, for implementing or integrating SAP with LDAP? So you need to know why, you should be sure of why you want to do it. What is the purpose of doing it, of doing this integration? So the main purpose you need to understand is, so to automate user provisioning process, okay, instead of spending time in manually creating user IDs in SAP, you could use SAP LDAP integration to automate the user provisioning process. Okay, so that way, you also make it consistent, the user records in SAP and LDAP or Active Directory consistent with each other. Okay, so things that you need to do, to consider is why you want to do this, why you want to integrate with SAP and adapt with SAP, what benefits would you get out of it, So for me, data consistency is there, if a user ID exists in Active Directory, you can create it in SAP. If the user ID, quits, if a user leaves the organization, so one of the first thing that happens is your record on the Active Directory side, the LDAP side is removed. So you can use SAP LDAP integration to automatically remove or lock the user ID, whichever way you prefer, to, what you want to do in SAP, right? If you want the user ID, once the user leaves the organization, with SAP LDAP integration, you can lock the user ID in SAP, or you could have this integration program to delete the user ID from SAP automatically. Okay, so if the user doesn't, if SAP does not find the user information on the Active Directory side, it will take appropriate action on the SAP side automatically. So there are a lot of advantages of doing this integration. Mainly it helps you to keep the user data, user information consistent between SAP and Active Directory. Now, what are the prerequisites for configuring or integrating SAP with LDAP? Okay, so basically there are three teams that get involved. Okay, and which are those three teams we'll talk in the next slide. So one of the things that needs to be, one of the things that is prerequisite is that at the operating system level, this program LDAP underscore RFC, okay, it's an executable type of file, right? So that needs to be run continuously, okay? So what you see on the screen is the syntax, LDAP underscore RFC minus -a, LDAP underscore program ID -x s and ampersand. Now that ampersand is the character that makes this LDAP underscore RFC program run continuously on the OS level. So this is a basis activity. Okay, so you would need your basis team to run this program for you on the on the operating system level. So I've given an example of what the syntax of that program is. So LDAP underscore SPS test is the program ID. Okay, and SPDDIC is the server name, and then SAPGW is the gateway of that server. And if you see at the end, there is an ampersand, so that LDAP underscore RFC is run continuously with this program ID called LDAP underscore SPS test. Okay, so but this is, like I said, this is a basis activity that needs to be done. Okay, and another prerequisite for you to configure SAP with LDAP is to have a service user ID on the Active Directory side, on the LDAP side. So this is created and given to you by the Active Directory team. So as you can imagine, you have three teams involved here. Okay, one is the basis team, because base system is the team that is going to create the RFC connection. Okay, and then also run that LDAP underscore RFC program at the operating system level. Okay, now who configures LDAP with SAP, Active Directory with SAP? It could be the basis team, it could be the security team. Okay, it all depends. So the configuration of LDAP is done through the transaction LDAP. Okay, so you need to create an LDAP connector. Okay, then you also need to generate the schema extension for the Active Directory. Okay, so the program is as to do that, to generate the schema extension is rs ldap schema ext. So you have to run that program. Okay, and once that schema extension is generated, you save that as an extension file and send it to the Active Directory team, the LDAP team. Okay, so then the Active Directory team extends the schema and you then define in SAP the mapping fields. Okay, so in the following screens we will see what are those, how the steps to do that. So on this slide that you're basically seeing the overview of the steps. Okay. So on the LDAP side, like I said, the LDAP team would have to create a service user ID. Okay, that will be part of your SAP LDAP configuration. And then LDAP will receive the file, the RS LDAP schema ext, the schema extension that is generated. You will have to send it to the LDAP team where, then they will have to extend it on their side. The schema directory has to be, updated to include the attributes that are generated for SAP. Okay, and once that is done, the LDAP team would also need to restart the system. Okay, now here's the thing, right? So the schema extension, the generated one, when you run that RS LDAP schema ext program, it is basically, it basically contains all the fields that you find in SU01. Okay, the user ID, the last name, first name, every tab that you see in SU01, you'll find the fields within those tabs as an attribute in this schema extension file. Okay, so when you send the file to the Active Directory team, they don't necessarily have to update their schema on the Active Directory side with all those attributes. You can tell them only the ones that you want them to extend. Okay, and I will give an example as to what I had done to automate this user provisioning. So for one of the customers, we didn't have GRC or any of the GRC type of solutions for user provisionings, and this is a long time ago. And we used to take about 25 to 30 minutes to provision a user ID. Okay, so there was a form that you used to get, and then there was an Excel file that we used to maintain with all the, the roles that would be assigned to a user in different, ECC system, CRM system, BI system, all that. So the whole process of provisioning user would take 30 minutes. So we used SAP LDAP integration to automate that, and we reduced that to a few seconds, the provisioning. Okay, but we did not include all the attributes that were coming from SAP in Active Directory. Okay, so we selected only a few, and the Active Directory team only updated the schema on the Active Directory side with only those attributes. Okay, we'll see what those are. So once the schema is extended, updated on the Active Directory side, the Active Directory would need to restart the directory system, Active Directory system, and also they will have to incorporate into their process to fill up values for the SAP related attributes. Okay, so there is some work that even the Active Directory team would need to do to help this integration. Okay, and after that, once this configuration is done on the SAP side and Active Directory team does its part, then you can go and use the program rs_ldap sync underscore user to synchronize the user data between SAP and LDAP system. Okay, so we'll see how those configuration steps. Okay, so the first step in the process, okay, is to create a RFC connection, which is a TCP/IP type. Okay, so if you see here, you give a RFC destination name, okay, and then the connection type is TCP/IP, and then the program ID. This is a program ID that you would be using at the OS level also. Okay, so in our example, we gave LDAP underscore SP test. Okay, this is a program ID that would be used in that LDAP underscore RFC program execution. Okay, and select, here you select the default gateway value. Okay, that's all this is done. This activity is done by the basis team. Okay, now once that is done, you also have to maintain the service user ID that the Active Directory team creates. Okay, remember we said LDAP team has to create a service user ID. So you need to maintain that user ID in a table called as LDAP user. Okay, so you go to SM30 and enter the user ID, the table name LDAP user, click on maintain, you will get this information. Okay, this box. And you enter the service user ID that is in the Active Directory team has given you here in the user ID field. And then you also need to get the distinguished name of the records where the user information is stored. User records are stored, okay? So the distinguished name is also given to you by the LDAP team. So you need the service user ID and you also need the distinguished name given to you by the Active Directory team. Okay, so once that is done, you click on this pencil icon, okay, and then you enter the password that the user and the LDAP team has given you. So these are the two prerequisites, three prerequisites actually. So two of them are done so far, are done by the base system, and this piece, the LDAP user entries, the information for that is given to you by the Active Directory team. So what are the two the base system does? One is creating of this RFC connection, TCP/IP RFC connection, and the second one is running this LDAP underscore RFC program, the prerequisites. Okay. Now, once that LDAP user table is maintained, you can then go to transaction LDAP. Okay. Your screen will look something like this. This is where you define your connectors and do the rest of your LDAP SAP configuration. Okay, so the first thing that you need to do here in the transaction LDAP is to create the LDAP connector. Okay, so you click on LDAP connector, this button here, LDAP connectors. Okay. And then the following screen that you get, you click on this display change icon, okay, to define the connectors. Okay, so in the connector name, you use the RFC connection name that you used, okay, so you basically use the same name, okay, LDAP underscore, whatever you give here in RFC connection. that also becomes your LDAP connector name. Okay. And then once you enter all your information about your application server, then you click on activate icon here. Okay, so when everything is good, the current status will turn green, and you'll get uh, the connector is active status at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so basically two things here. One, the connector name is the same as the RFC destination name that you have created. And secondly, you also have to give the application server name. And then finally, you have to click on the activate button. Okay, then once that is done, you can click on save and then come back to the back icon to come to this particular screen. Okay, here you have to specify or maintain, specify the server details of your Active Directory LDAP servers. Okay, so you click on the change button and then you get the LDAP servers button on the top when you're in the change mode. Okay, so when you get a screen like this, okay, when you click on new entries, so you give the server name. Okay, here you can specify the server host name or the IP address of the server. So generally, IP addresses work. Okay, so you specify the IP address here. The port number is standard, pretty much 389 is standard. Then from this drop-down field under the product name, you pick your Active Directory's LDAP product name. Okay, like I said earlier, Microsoft Active Directory is basically Microsoft Windows proprietary product. So in most cases, it would be Active Directory. So depending on what your LDAP solution is that has been used, you pick from this list from a drop down. Okay. The base entry is your distinguished name that this can be given to you by the you need to get this from the Active Directory team, the base entry of parameter. Okay, in the system logon field, you enter the system ID that was created on the Active Directory side. Okay, so you need to, in this particular screen step, you need to specify your Active Directory server related details. Okay, so server name is to identify the lab system, host name or the IP address. Okay, as far as the IP address of the LDAP server. Port number is, like I said, is pretty standard. 389 is constant for Windows Active Directory systems. Okay, and in the product name, like I said earlier, select the LDAP product that is being used. Okay, log version, you select LDAP 3. This is also standard. And in the LDAP application field, I forgot to mention, you could select the value user from the drop-down. Okay, select user. And in the base entry field, which is something that you can get from the Active Directory team. Okay, so your Active Directory administrators can give you the exact composition of this entry. So get it from them, and that service system logon, you use the system user ID that you get from the LDAP team. Then you click on save button on the top and then come back. So once that is done, to test the user ID, so to test the configuration, what you do is you come back to the LDAP transaction, okay, the initial screen of LDAP transaction, and click on enter the server name. okay, that you created and the connector that you created. Okay, and then you click on log on. Okay, so you get a field like this. So you click on use system user, and then automatically this particular fields become gray out, and then you click on execute. Okay, so click on execute. After you choose, select the use system user checkbox. So once that is done, you will see that status of the LDAP connector, the connection turns to green. And then you can also use this find button anytime you want to search for a user ID from this point on. Okay, once this configuration is properly set. Okay, you can use this find button to search for user information. So you can read data, LDAP data, Active Directory data within SAP. Okay, you don't need to go and use any other tool to find out any user related information from Active Directory. You can use this find icon to do it. So that's not icon, the button to do it. Okay. Now, once the configuration is done, the basic configuration, okay, that LDAP is now, SAP and LDAP are now connected with each other. So we haven't finished the integration steps yet, okay, the configuration is not done yet. Basically now, SAP and LDAP are not talking to each other at this point. Okay, so the next step in the process is to directory schema extension. So what you're doing here is that with the schema extension, you create attributes for SAP specific fields in your Active Directory system. Okay, so for example, username, SAP username field is one of those attributes. Okay, so you have the following options to extend the schema. One, you can generate the schema extension, or you manually create the attributes in the directory system. Okay, so either which way, these two steps you can have the Active Directory team to do for you. Okay. Now, why do you have to do this schema extension? Is because before SAP user data is stored in your directory server, you may have to extend the directory schema so that it contains attributes for SAP specific fields. Okay. So to include your SAP specific fields in the Active Directory schema, you have to use the schema extension program. Okay, what is that program? The program name is RS LDAP schema ext. So you run that program using either SC38 or SA38. Okay, so you get a product field, which is a drop-down field from where you can select the product that you're using, LDAP product that you're using, and then you click on execute. Once you click on execute, you'll get a screen output like this, okay? It doesn't, when you look at it, it's like a program that you see in the code of a program, okay? But what basically it is it lists you the different attributes, SAP, attributes that can be extended in Active Directory schema, okay? And it also tells you what to do with this particular information, okay? So you go to SA38 or AC38 and execute this report RS LDAP schema ext. Okay, then you get an output like this. So if you see here, for example, CN SAP username, right, which is your SAP user ID. Okay, so username, and then you have this, you have SAP alias here, right? So there's another one, another field in SAP. right? Alias field. So similarly, you have something here, SAP company, right? So you will, this output of that program will list the attribute related information that the schema would need. Okay. So what you do is you make a copy this, select everything as you say Control A, Control C on the screen and put it in a notepad file and save that file as a .ldf file. Okay. And send this file, that LDF file, to the Active Directory, and the Active Directory team would then use it for extending the schema on their side uh, with the file that you have sent, and then restart the directory server, the LDAP server. Now you don't have to tell the Active Directory team to extend the schema with every single attribute from that file. Okay, you can cherry pick the ones that you want. Okay, for example, when I used LCPL, this integration for automating user provisioning on my project, I basically asked the Active Directory team to extend the schema with this six uh, attributes. And if you really look at closely, they're all fields on the SU01 screen. Okay, so SAP class is the user group in the logon data tab. SAP groups is the field in the SAP, the group, the groups tab. Okay. SNC name is the SNC field in SNC tab. Valid to and valid from are the fields in the logon data tab also. So if you see all of these fields, okay, all of these attributes rather, are also not the fields in SU01. So for my automation purposes, I wanted the user ID. Okay. I wanted the last name, first name basically. And then I also wanted the user group to be maintained so that the user groups will come from Active Directory into SAP. I didn't want to maintain it in SAP. So valid to and valid from. So usually, valid to, valid from dates are also maintained at the Active Directory side. When you have temporary workers or temporary contractors, those kinds of groups of people. So I wanted even the valid to and valid from dates coming from uh, Active Directory. So I asked the Active Directory team to include these two fields in the schema extension. And because we were using single sign-on, and single sign-on SNC tab, you have a particular format for that, right? To enter in SU01. So we asked the Active Directory team to maintain even that particular field on the Active Directory side, and we used the group concept, the groups tab, to come up with a user group name, and based on which the roles were assigned to the users. Okay, so even though the default SAP LDAP synchronization program doesn't do the role assignment, that kind of thing, you could have you can have your ABAP programmer can give your requirements to the ABAP programmer, and then he can there are some hooks, what they call as hooks now, or user exits for old timers, where you can develop have code written in some user exits and to do this rest of the stuff that you want. So in my case, roles, I wanted this entire process to even assign the roles. So I use this SAP groups concept tab to do that. Okay, so we came up with a logic of assigning roles to users. So we used that logic and came up with the group's name, and then we went through another logic to assign the roles. Okay, so the point here is the schema extension that RSLDEP schema file generates, right? This file generates, you can either have the Active Directory team, extend the LDAP schema completely with that file that is sent to them, or you could basically give them the attributes that you want to be implemented or to be used. You give them the list of attributes and the Active Directory team can only extend their schema with only those attributes. Okay, but then they also have to make, write a script or do something to populate the values within this group, within these attributes. Okay, so once these attributes are extended on the Active Directory side, now you will have to configure the directory mapping and configure the directory synchronization. Okay, so these are so synchronization of data between SAP and Active Directory is a two-step process. Okay, one is the mapping, other is the synchronization. So you come back to the LDAP transaction, or you can execute LDAP map, the transaction LDAP map. You come to the screen, you click on the change, get into the change mode. Okay, so the change mode will open. Then you click on the mapping overview screen. Okay, so you double click on the mapping folder on the left and the mapping overview screen opens up. Okay, so this section initially will be empty. Okay, so what you do is, so to get all these attributes, right, the fields and the attributes, you click on the import proposal button in the toolbar here next to the delete icon on the left. Okay, so once you do that, you'll get a box, you click on yes, and this section will be populated with the field names and the attribute names. So these attributes that you see on the attribute column, under the attribute column, these are Active Directory attributes. These are what you see here on the field are the fields in SU01. So if you see here, username, okay, mapping B name, right? That is mapped with SAP username, which is the user ID. First name is in the SAP side is equal to given name on the Active Directory side. Last name on the SAP side is same as SN on the Active Directory side. Function is title on Active Directory. Okay, so based on what data you want to import from Active Directory into SAP, you will have to map these attributes. Okay, so the first step in this process is to get the fields list, show up. So you click on the import proposal icon on the toolbar and you get this information here. Okay, when I say information, that is basically the fields that are available on the SU01 screen and the associated or related attributes under the attribute column, which are your attributes from your Active Directory. Okay. After that, you need to configure the mapping. Okay. So basically, when you import the proposals, you don't make any changes on the mapping side. Okay. So just do the import proposals and don't do anything else after that on that particular step. So once you save it and you go back, and then you configure, the next step in the process is to configure the attributes for synchronization purposes. Okay, now this is the step where you set the synchronization direction for each field using the synchronization indicator. So from an SAP system's point of view, each field is synchronized either as an incoming or outgoing. Okay. So what you do is, so you click on the synchronization folder on the left, basically synchronization folder on the left. Then you get to the screen again. Okay. The most important part here is, remember this. You have a column called import mapping. Okay. The second last column here. This is the indicator. When you set this indicators here, checkboxes, that means you're telling SAP and LDAP to import these attributes from LDAP into SAP. Okay, this is very important for synchronizing. Okay, so which means when you run the synchronization program, the user record will be created in SU01 and these fields will be populated from LDAP. So which is user ID, for example, because that is checked, user ID is created. Then the first name is populated in SU01 in the address data tab because given name is checked here, first name is populated, last name is populated, job title is populated, department is populated, and email ID is populated in SU01 address data tab. Okay, so any field that you want to get populated in SU01, you need to check that checkbox under the import mapping column. Okay. Okay. So some of the other fields that you could synchronize would be SAP username, given name, title, telephone number, language, valid from, valid to, time zone, date format. Okay. Now you also have, if you really, this is not the entire list that you're seeing here, but you could also see when you do this in SAP screens, and when you look at the SAP screens in real, you'll also find, at the bottom of this list, you'll also find SAP roles. Okay, so which means you have a mechanism where, roles can be also, you can bring in the role names also from Active Directory into SAP, and the roles if the roles exist in SAP, the roles are assigned to the user. Okay. So this particular checkbox is really important, okay, for importing the data from importing the data from Active Directory into SAP. Now when you configure GRC, right, you won't be doing this part. For synchronizing user IDs between LDAP and SAP, how do you do that? Using this program called LDAP, RS LDAP sync underscore user. So this is the last step, right? So with this mapping, right, your LDAP SAP integration is complete. Okay, this is the last step in configuring or integrating SAP with LDAP. After that, to test or to create user IDs automatically in SAP, okay, getting the acts and the data from LDAP. There is a synchronization program that SAP gives you. So RS LDAP sync underscore user. So you go to SA38 or AC38 and run this program. But when you run this program in blanket, right, SAP Start DDS and Early Watch users are excluded, okay, when they are not considered into provisioning or synchronization purposes. Okay, now there are two things, actually one main thing with this program is it does not sync the password of the user from Active Directory into SAP. Okay, so even though the user ID will get created the way you want it automatically with every bit of information that you have mapped for import, password is not one of those fields. So that is where, having a user exec written for these kinds of, for password association, and then you could also have a writer use the user execs to code email notification also, which I did. Okay, so once the user ID is created, you can have an email notification sent out automatically with the user ID, another email with the password. Okay, so you can customize this program, okay, using user exits. So that feature is available with this program, okay, with this report. So to synchronizing the user information from LDAP Active Directory into SAP, you use this program. Okay, so we'll see the screens next. And there are three categories of how the data, in which you can synchronize this data. Okay, we'll see what those three are. So one is the objects that exist in both the directory, which is Active Directory, and the database, meaning the user ID exists on both sides. Okay. So what are the three options you have? One is the compare timestamp, okay, which is you want to check if there is any change, there is any difference between the user information on SAP with the Active Directory, the user record in Active Directory. Okay, then you use compare timestamp. You can also ignore timestamp, and you can also ignore objects totally. If you don't want to do anything with this, you can say both. Okay, you can ignore objects. Okay, so with ignore timestamp, all objects are synchronous according to the synchronization indicators in transaction LDAP map. Okay, and ignore objects is basically data synchronization. So you use this radio button, right? Compare timestamp for creating user IDs. So what you do here is when you run this program, RDAP LDAP sync, you have to specify the LDAP server and the LDAP connector. These are something that you have configured in the transaction LDAP. Okay. So you specify that, and then you also have two choices here. One, you can specify the specific user ID or user IDs, or you use this checkbox to do a blanket search and creation. Okay. Now, if the user ID needs to be created, in that case, you would use this combination that you're seeing here on the screen. Okay, compare timestamp, and then under objects that exist only in the directory. Okay, so this first section, objects that exist both in directory and in the database, you use this to do updates for existing records on both sides. If the user ID exists on both SAP and Active Directory, and if there are any updates on the Active Directory side, you want that to be updated on SAP side, you would then use this option. Okay. Now, to create a user ID, okay, you use this combination, okay. An object that exists both in directory and in the database, you select compare timestamps, and then you see this option here under objects that only exist in the directory, which means objects that only exist in Active Directory. Okay. So any user ID that exists only on Active Directory but not in SAP, what do you want to do? Okay. So you can either create it in the database. Here in this case, database means SAP. Delete it from the directory, which you don't want to do. And your purpose is for creating the user IDs, right? So you specify the LDAP server name, the connector name, the user ID here if you want to, and then under the first section you create some objects that exist both in directory and database. You say compare timestamp, and in the second section objects that only exist in the directory you say create in database, and then in the third section objects that only exist in database you can say ignore objects. Okay, so with this combination of radio buttons, if you specify the user ID here, the user ID will be created in SAP with data coming from LDAP Active Directory for the attributes that have been marked for input. Okay, the next one is the third option is here. Okay, so this is for this combination that you see here is for provisioning purposes. Okay, and the third and the last section that you have on the screen is primarily, I would say, you could use it for deprovisioning purposes. Meaning, if you want the user ID to be logged, okay, the user has left the company, and then one of the things that happens, the first thing that happens is Active Directory team removes it from their side, okay, from the schema. They move it to a different path on the Active Directory, or they delete it completely altogether, right? So which means that user ID is no longer visible for or available for SAP, right? So in that case, you can run the same program again, rs LDAP sync underscore user, to either lock it in SAP or delete it in SAP. Okay, so the screenshot is not correct. Okay, but objects that only exist in the database, right? So once that user leaves the company and Active Directory team removes it records from their side, now technically speaking that user ID only exists on the SAP side, right? So objects that only exist in the database. So what do you need to do when you run the synchronization program? So it doesn't find it on the Active Directory side. Okay, so you can say ignore objects in the second box, objects that only exist in directory. You can click on ignore objects. And the first box, you can say compare timestamp. Okay, and to deprovision the users in SAP, you can either choose, depending on what your policy is, you can either choose lock in database or delete in database. Based on that, the user ID that you enter on the user ID field here will either be locked or deleted. Okay. Now there is a transaction code called LDAP log. Okay. So you can use the transaction code for checking the logs of this program execution. So every time you execute this program, a log is generated, and you can check it in the LDAP log transaction code. Okay. Okay. So that brings me to the end of this particular session that I wanted to talk about today. So most of us, like I said in the beginning, right, we would have seen LDAP from a GRC standpoint for as LDAP as a data source for GRC. Okay, what we talked about here in this video is that SAP and LDAP can be integrated. I'm trying to find. Yeah, SAP and LDAP can be integrated for user provisioning purposes within SAP, even if you don't have GRC. Okay, so three teams are involved in this, as to summarize it. One is the basis team, because you need them to run that LDAP underscore RFC program to, to run continuously on the operating system level. Again, many of you would have found, seen this program, this issue with it in GRC also. So whenever, sometimes what happens is when base system does the system refresh, if they forget to run this LDAP underscore RFC program, you would not be able to submit the access requests, right? So you get some error, and one of those reasons is this program is not running. LDAP is not getting, so GRC is not able to talk to LDAP. Okay, because LDAP is your data source. So running LDAP underscore RFC is one of the key things within GRC also. Okay, so this program needs to run. Okay, LDAP underscore RFC, and the base system does that for you. You also need base system to create this RFC connection for you, the TCP/IP RFC connection in SM59. Okay. After that, you also need help from the Active Directory team. Okay, so there are three pieces of information, that you need them for. Okay, one, you need them to create a service user ID on the Active Directory side, and which can be used by you to do the SAP LDAP integration configuration. Okay, so you need a service user ID from them and the password for it. Second thing, you need their help to give you the distinguished name string parameter, the entry values, entry for you to maintain it in the configuration, LDAP configuration in SAP. Okay, and the third and thing, and the most important part, is that you need their help to extend the schema on the Active Directory side to include the SAP attributes, okay, from that you generate with that schema extension program. So you need the basis team, now you need the Active Directory team to do this, and then you can, with these two things, activities done on the LDAP side and the Active Directory side and the basis side, you can now go and configure LDAP and SAP. Okay, so the transactions you use for configuring LDAP and SAP is LDAP is the transaction, and you can also use the transaction LDAP map. Okay, to define the mapping of SAP fields with LDAP attributes. Okay. To synchronize the data as far as the mapping is concerned, the import mapping checkbox, okay, under the synchronization folder in transaction LDAP map is the key, because those are the attributes, those are the values that get imported into SAP when the user IDs are created using that synchronization program RS LDAP sync underscore user. Okay. I have some demo videos on this, but I'm trying to find a way to post them. Okay, because those videos that I recorded had the IP addresses and server names of the place where I recorded them, but I cannot make them public. Okay, but if I do find a way to hide those pieces of information, I will definitely show those videos with you. Okay, so with this, I'm going to end this video for today. I'll talk to you in the next video.